Good evening. I'm David Ferriero. Welcome to the National Archives. We're glad you could join us this evening for our program, DC Emancipation in 19th Century Life, whether you're here in the McGowan Theater or joining us on our YouTube channel. Our partners for tonight's program are the National Museum of African American History and Culture and the District of Columbia Government, and we thank them for their support. Before we begin tonight's discussion, I'd like to let you know about two other programs coming up here in the McGowan Theater. On Monday, April 20th at 7 p.m., Cokie Roberts will be here to talk about her latest book, Capital Dames, The Civil War and the Women of Washington, 1848 to 1868. Presidential historian Michael Beschloss will join her to discuss contributions of the women of Washington, D.C. and the war-torn capital. Then on Thursday, April 23rd at 7 p.m., we'll take a look at First Ladies, Private Lives, Public Image with Susan Swain, President and Co-Chief Operating Officer of C-SPAN, and who will lead a discussion about our nation's First Ladies. To learn more about these and all of our programs and exhibits, consult our monthly calendar of events. There are copies in the lobby as well as sign-up sheets where you can get it by regular mail or by email. And you'll also find other brochures about upcoming exhibits and programs here at the National Archives. And another way to get more involved in the National Archives is to become a member of the Foundation for the National Archives. The Foundation supports all of our education and outreach activities, and there are applications for membership in the lobby also. And if you're joining us by YouTube, you can find out more about our programs and how to support them on our website, archives.gov/museum. President Abraham Lincoln signed the DC Emancipation Act into law on this day in 1862, 8.5 months before he issued the Emancipation Proclamation. The act granted the immediate emancipation of slaves within the district and compensation to loyal Unionist slaveholders. Slaveholders seeking compensation brought their cases before a board of commissioners. Owners had to give a physical description and valuation of each enslaved person. Many of them gave even more information, such as family relationships, personal histories, and occupational skills. The board's records, now here in the National Archives, give us a rich source of information about individual slaves, slaveholders, and life in the District of Columbia in the mid-19th century. Our holdings also include the records of the U.S. Circuit Court for the District of Columbia, where you can find manumission papers for slaves freed before the 1862 Act, emancipation papers for those freed as a result of the 1862 Act, and affidavits or certificates of freedom which served as proof of the bearer's status as free persons. These papers, created to document government business, now allow us a glimpse of the lives of the individuals whose lives were forever changed by slavery and freedom. With these documents, we can put names and descriptions to those who might otherwise have been nameless. The records we preserve and protect in the National Archives hold countless stories of people and communities. Those of us who work here are proud to hold this trust and ensure that these stories will be open to future discoveries by generations to come. To get our discussion going and to introduce our panelists, I'd like to welcome to the stage Lauren Vaughn, the Secretary of the District of Columbia, whose office oversees the DC Archives. Lauren?
Good evening. This is a beautiful theater. I'm embarrassed to say I've never been here before, but I will be coming back. It's absolutely beautiful. Thank you, David, for that wonderful introduction. I bring you greetings from our new mayor, Muriel Bowser. As David reminded us all, today is Emancipation Day, and I have spent most of the day with the mayor at various activities celebrating and commemorating this very important day. Today is the 153rd anniversary of the freeing of 3,100 slaves here in the District of Columbia, 8.5 months prior to the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation. So it's a really, really big deal here in DC, and as you know, it is a legal holiday here in DC. So I started out this morning at a prayer breakfast where the Reverend Al Sharpton was the keynote speaker. And then I marched in the parade with the mayor, and we had a luncheon, and I left the concert to come here to be with you. There was a band on stage playing go-go music, and I happen to be a big fan of go-go music. So anyway, I'm happy to be here tonight. As David indicated, the Office of the Secretary here in Washington functions very much like the Secretary of State, but because we are not yet a state, there are many, many things that come under my purview, and one of those very important functions is the Office of Public Records and the DC Archives. And I'm happy to say that Mayor Bowser has made the DC Archives a priority. There is funding in the capital budget for a new DC Archives, and I actually testified about it yesterday before Chairman Mendelson. So it is a priority for DC. We want to preserve and protect the valuable records and historical artifacts that are housed in our in the DC Archives. And so it is a priority, and it is something that I'm working on, and you hear me say it today, you heard me say it yesterday. If you happen to catch the hearing, our mayor is committed to that. So I'm very happy to be here to speak with you all today, and to participate and to listen to this great panel that we have. I would like to introduce our esteemed panelists. I'm going to start with our moderator, Dr. Maurice Jackson. He teaches history in the department at Georgetown University. He's also written several books. And then our three panelists, Dr. Chris Myers-Ash, who teaches history at Colby College and at the University of Maine in Augusta. Dr. Elizabeth Clark-Lewis is the director of public history and, the public history program at Howard University. She's also had academic appointments at George Washington University, Penn State University, and Northern Virginia Community College. And then Dr. Derek Musgrove, who is an assistant professor of history at the University of Maryland in Baltimore County. Can I please have our panelists and our moderator come to the stage? Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Lauren, the new and, from what we can tell, very qualified and able Secretary of the City Council. Thank you all for coming. I'm not John Whittington Franklin. I'm substituting for him. I could never be a substitute. I just do the best I can and try to make it flow. But tonight we have in many ways a mission. As you know, in 1862, Lincoln wrote to Horace Greeley, "I'm a little uneasy about the abolishment of slavery in the district, but I would be glad to see it abolished, but it's the time of doing it." He didn't feel the time was ready, but he was pushed, and it came. And when it came, Douglas says, not only is it a staggering blow to slavery throughout the country, but a killing blow to the rebellion. Douglas saw DC Emancipation just that much. And he said, I trust that I am dreaming. I trust that I am dreaming. But events taking place seem like a dream because it has such a great resonance for him. Soon, as you know, many people started flooding in, contraband and others, in the summer of '62. And Elizabeth Keckley said this, fresh from the bonds of slavery, fresh from the benighted regions of the plantations, they came to the capital looking for liberty. And so it did. So many blacks came here looking for that liberty. And these are the things that we want to briefly speak about tonight. Now, tonight, we have several events to pay a special attention to. The bells tolled the other day for the 150th anniversary of the Appomattox at the end of the Civil War. The bells tolled for the great emancipator, the 150th anniversary of his death. Today, as we were told, there are celebrations for DC emancipation. But I want you to think about this. Just think a minute. When DC is first abolished, Frederick Douglass speaks. Senator Sumner and Wilson speak. Senator John Mercer Langston, the Dean of Howard Law School, speaks. Ulysses Grant speaks. We have to up DC emancipation to that. It's all right to have Dougie Fresh and Eric Bennett, but they're not Frederick Douglass, and they're not Sumner, and they're not Langston. The other day I went to an exhibit up the street at the National Portrait Gallery. It was called On Mingering Mike. I won't go much, but it's about this black guy who made record covers. Right next door to it was an exhibit of the White House years in Washington. So it was okay. But then Monday I went to Anacostia. And I urge all of you to go see the Anacostia exhibit there. It is as fine as you would want to see, talking about the black presence here in Washington. So think about that and think about the contrast. It is important to you. Today we want to look at certain questions, and I'll begin to pose those to our illustrious speakers. And we'll start, I'll start with, to my immediate right, with Dr. Clark Lewis, and deal with some of the cultural aspects. And that is, what do you think were the central networks that blacks created before emancipation that allowed them to begin to celebrate DC Emancipation Day?
I think that, as you said, thank you very much, and I thank the archivist and the Secretary of the District of Columbia for such a wonderful introduction. I think that when we think about networks of support that were created by African Americans before emancipation, the major area that we have to look at would be the churches. Dr. Ida Jones did an incredible article for a volume we put together at Howard University called First Freed. And one of the things that she was able to establish, utilizing records from all over the city, including those of the National Archives, was the untiring work of the churches of the District of Columbia. From 1814 with the Mount Zion United Methodist Church in Georgetown, the 15th Street Presbyterian Church and its illustrious history, the the Metropolitan AME Church, the 19th Street Baptist Church, Israel Baptist, and a number of other churches worked tirelessly to become this area of support, a safe haven, we might call it, for African Americans prior to the Civil War. I think that it is so very important to understand African Americans on many levels were agents of change. They worked very hard before the Civil War to create an environment that allowed and embraced freedom. Those who were freed African Americans, as well as those who were enslaved, understood the meaning of freedom, its challenges, but also understanding the important civic pride that they had as persons here in the District of Columbia, as residents, and as you said, those who migrated here, with the hope that freedom would come and equality would follow that. I think that those networks of support also can be traced when you're using family records, and I think that those family records become very important when you look at the records and the long history of families like, and I'm thinking in particular of Dr. Paul Phillips Cook, who, although the descendant of an enslaved person, had freedom come to his family in the 1830s. And he, like many families, had very extensive records, some of which were in their homes, some of which are in the archives, but many are also still in the churches. So I do hope that those of you here today, or those of you who have an interest in emancipation, also look at the local records and the importance of local records. And our archives, the DC archives, are just a wealth of information on life in the District of Columbia prior to freedom. And the staff worked very, very hard to make those records available. My students at Howard use them extensively, and the records of the archives, as well as the churches, really give us an important segue into that culture and those networks that led to those important networks of freedom.
Well, thank you, Dr. Clark-Lewis. And so let's go to Christopher Myers-Ash. Looking at this, what was the essential importance of emancipation? How did it change the city? Did it change the city? Did it change it for the better? Did it change relations?
Sure. Well, the quick answer is yes, but I imagine you want me to elaborate a little bit on, on that. You know, when I was first learning history, it was sort of fashionable to belittle the importance of emancipation and to talk about the limitations of emancipation, and certainly the Emancipation Proclamation. And there certainly were limits to it, but I know historians in the more recent decades have really gone back to emancipation to look at how revolutionary it was. You know, Eric Foner in his History of Reconstruction starts on January 1st, 1863 with emancipation, because he says that changes everything, and that is what transforms this country. It's what transforms this city, certainly earlier than it does elsewhere. You know, one of the things that's really interesting about DC is that a lot of the things that are going to take place elsewhere in the South, especially during Reconstruction, happen in DC first. They sort of get field tested in DC first. And so a lot of the explosive arguments are taking place in DC during and immediately after the war. You know, I always think it's interesting. Maurice talked about how we've been celebrating and recognizing the 150th anniversary of the war. You know, the past 4 years. You know, it started with Sumter, and you know, now we've gotten to Lincoln's assassination this week, and you know, the New York Times has had this Road to Disunion, this big celebration in its pages. But I wonder if we're going to do the same for Reconstruction, right? Because that's what's happening next after 1865. Are we going to really grapple with the questions of Reconstruction the way we've been looking at the Civil War? Because in a lot of ways, the modern world, the modern America that we live in now is the world of Reconstruction. It's not the world of the Civil War. You know, we have lots of Civil War buffs who are fascinated by every battle and, you know, what General Lee ate for breakfast. But they don't care really what happens in Reconstruction. And it's Reconstruction that helps us understand Ferguson, Missouri, right? It's Reconstruction that helps us understand what's going on racially today, you know what's going on in the last 150 years. So I hope we'll pay attention to what happens in Reconstruction over the next few years to take emancipation and understand how it transforms, first of all, this city. I mean, it changes the relationship between the races entirely. It flips everything on its head. You know, by the time emancipation comes around, all the Southern Democrats are gone, right? So the Republicans have essentially a free hand in Congress to do what they want. And so emancipation is just the beginning in D.C., right? There's a burst of legislation in the spring of 1862 where the Republicans you know, take advantage of this situation, right? They capitalize on this political opportunity, and they establish free public schools for black children, right? They make it illegal to discriminate against blacks in jury service, and they do a host of things. They get rid of the black codes that had governed black life, free and enslaved, for the previous since the city's founding. And so emancipation starts this tidal wave of change, and it helps encourage this massive migration, the first great migration, if you will, to the city. Slaves seeing Washington as this beacon of hope, this island of freedom in the South, particularly slaves from Maryland and Virginia, but also you know, from throughout the South, trying to make their way to D.C. because this was an island of hope. And you know, what happens is extraordinary. I mean, by 1866, you have this tremendous celebration of Emancipation Day out on Franklin Square. You have an Emancipation Day parade that goes on so long. You know, Otis Howard, who was the head of the Freedmen's Bureau, said you couldn't see the end of it. There was no point at which you could see the end. There were thousands and thousands and thousands of mostly black paraders, but whites as well, white abolitionists who were there as well, congregating on Franklin Square and saying, look, emancipation was great. This is wonderful. Give us the vote. And the work will be done, right? And so they're not just celebrating emancipation and saying, let's be grateful, let's thank you know, the great emancipator for what he did, but they're flexing their political muscle. They're saying, give us the vote. We are now free men. We want the vote. And so black suffrage becomes the crystallizing battle in the post-Civil War era, where they're talking, you know, it's not good enough to just have freedom, right? To just be legally emancipated. We want power as well. We want to have a say in how this city and this nation are governed. And so emancipation allows for a complete revolution. I mean, 5 years before that meeting on Franklin Square, it was illegal for black folks to have a gun. And now you have whole regiments of black soldiers marching down Pennsylvania Avenue. Right? 5 years before that meeting, before emancipation, DC was still a slave city. Slavery was on the wane, but it was still there. And the Southern defenders of slavery saw it as tremendously important. Even if there was a small number of slaves, only a few thousand slaves, it was tremendously important symbolically for the South. But now slavery is over. With emancipation, slavery is over, and now you have black people assuming that they are going to be political equals in this land. I mean, the changes were tremendous and revolutionary.
Okay. Let's go to George. I want to pose this to you to follow up on that. What was the often people, when they look at African Americans, they look at one people. And it's obvious that D.C. was just not quite that way. They were freed blacks, they were non-free blacks, there were many others. But what was it? Go into a little bit more about this relationship between the black residents and the freed people, especially after emancipation.
Sure. Well, and I'll pick up on a theme that Chris voiced just a moment ago. First off, thanks to the National Archives, the D.C. government, and especially to the woman sitting next to me, Elizabeth Clark Lewis. One of the reasons that we're here is because of a handful of people, including Dr. Clark Lewis, who revived the Emancipation Day celebrations in the 80s and 90s. And her work with Loretta Carter Haynes, who's really the bedrock of that group, brings us back here tonight and sort of was the seed of many of the celebrations that we've participated in today. So the DC Emancipation Act frees 3,128 folks in the city. The federal government pays approximately $300 a piece for each one of them. And that's really not a lot of people. It's only approximately, I think, a quarter of the black population of the city. There's about 11,000 African Americans who are free in the city at the time, pardon my math. And what you see afterward is this huge influx of African Americans from Maryland and Virginia, which Chris mentioned a moment ago, at a number roughly 10 times the number of people who were freed. So somewhere in the area of 30,000 to 34,000 contraband come into the city. And so you have three groups of black folks in the city at the end of the Civil War. You have those who were free before the DC Compensated Emancipation Act. You have the first freed, the 3,000 plus who were freed by the act. And then you have the contraband, as people called them at the time, who fled Maryland and Virginia into the city, and who really, until Maryland abolished slavery in 1864, led a relatively precarious existence, because some of them were picked up by the Metropolitan Police Department, taken back to Maryland. I mean, their freedom was not secure, based on the agreements that had been worked out with the federal government in the state of Maryland, which, of course, the federal government was seeking to keep loyal but still a slave state. Those folks could still be apprehended and taken back to their masters as long as their masters were loyal. And so you have these three groups of people, all of whom get together for the first couple of Emancipation Day celebrations. And that's, I would argue, for the first 10 to 15 years of these celebrations, their strength. They're able to cross-cut the black community and represent all of these different groups of people. But there were, and I'll just leave it at this and we'll go to the other questions, but there were tensions. Bishop Daniel Payne of the AME Church delivers a sermon right before the act is passed in 1862, and he sort of lectures the folks who are emerging from slavery, and certainly he was happy that they were, and he was welcoming them into the larger black community of the city. But he says, look, you all have responsibilities, and so we expect you to take on those responsibilities, act accordingly, and to a certain degree, if you read it ingenuously, don't embarrass us when you come out of slavery and pick up the benefits of freedom. And you saw in that sermon some of the tensions that would really explode later on very publicly in the 1880s in big splits within the African American community around the Emancipation Day parade. But I'll save that for a little bit later in the conversation.
Well, thank you. Let's look back at more in depth at the parades. And Dr. Clark Lewis, especially with your work on this, what do you see was the key cultural impacts upon this? What did it bring, and what legacies did people bring with them? As you know, some criticism, and we'll talk a little bit later, was about the type things that people wore. Many people came with their work. They were hard carriers, bricklayers. They would wear their clothes. Many wore costumes. If we're in New Orleans, no one would have thought anything about it. But in D.C., it became a sort of divisive thing. But it added a lot to the culture of the city. And tell us a little bit about that.
I think that you have to look at works like Shane White and Graham White's work, Styling, but more importantly, Alan Taylor's most recent work, which was a Pulitzer Prize-winning work on the internal enemy. He talked about from 1772 to 1832, the African-American community had many cultural traits, and those traits survived, and he talked about the various ways they survived in the community. For people such as myself, I'm the direct descendant of an enslaved person who was freed in 1865. But I, as the opening of my book talks about the fact that there was a great deal of respect for African Americans in Washington and the whole issue of emancipation. I grew up hearing people talking about the first freed and having an ancestor who, because of the efforts of people in Washington, became free. They constantly thought back, talked about, and more importantly, had untiring respect for the work that was done here in Washington. So when you think about the parades are an external manifestation of freedom. And freedom is an intangible that is very important for those who are the descendants of enslaved people. It's very, very hard to talk about, and I read and have read all the materials that many people have maintained about enslavement and freedom. But I also had extensive oral histories with people whose ideas really aren't sometimes captured, and how much respect there was for people who worked for freedom, but more importantly, how long they were able to talk about the importance of the parades, and more importantly, when the parades ended. Constance Green's award-winning, Pulitzer Prize-winning book on Washington maintains that the parades and the emancipation celebrations ended in 1899, when the entire African-American community, when interviewed, makes it clear that those parades, those ideas and ideals were maintained up through the 1950s, because historians or those in power didn't write about them or recognize them, didn't mean they didn't exist. And the external manifestations, the parades, the public activities don't end. And that's the key, I think, is that this unwillingness to let these issues go, these freedom and ideals of freedom, they are significant to the way African Americans across the country look to and have looked toward Washington. When I was doing research, I would talk to different people, and constantly I was amazed. A woman did an extensive interview with me telling me about freedom and how Washington's freedom was celebrated in a small community in Ohio. I kept saying to her daughter, Dr. Titi, and I would say, but how in the world is your mother so clear on this issue of freedom in Washington? And she would constantly say that this was just an unbelievable and important paradigm shift for Africans all over the country. These African Americans saw Washington and this freedom as being very, very significant. And so when Mrs. Cisco could talk in detail about how in these segregated schools in Ohio they were celebrating emancipation, it just forces us to understand that going beyond the scholar and the scholarship, freedom resonated with African Americans all over the nation, and the Washington experience was singular for people all over this country. So I think that there are many ways of understanding and appreciating this freedom, but it is universally understood. Richland Goddard did a series in the book First Freed about newspapers and how African Americans prior to the Civil War were writing about the activities, and much of it dealt with the freedom and the issues of freedom being constantly written about and talked about in Washington. So I think that this whole issue of freedom and its meaning for African Americans takes on a special symbolism for people who were a part of what we call the masses of African Americans. And frequently their voices just simply aren't heard in the scholarship, but that doesn't mean it doesn't have a significance and a real meaning in people's lives.
Thank you. Chris Miles, as you, in your remarks, you mentioned that at one point there was white participation. Why don't you tell us a little bit more about the relationship of the races? Did it advance? Did it go back? What happened during this era?
Sure. So there had been cooperation between white abolitionists and black abolitionists, primarily on a middle class level before the war. Washington was, along with Baltimore, they were about the only two southern cities that had anti-slavery activities. Elsewhere in the South, it was just too dangerous. But because of the presence of the national government here, you had sympathetic members of Congress there. So there was a small local population of black and white abolitionists who worked together. That coalition kind of falls apart during the war, but it's replaced by a very new and very different coalition that's oriented around power, right? Around political organizing. Because now with emancipation and soon after the war, you get black suffrage. It takes a couple years. It takes a lot of fighting, a lot of organizing on the part of the black community and their radical Republican allies, who are always a minority in Congress. And they have to push to get black suffrage by 1867. Once that happens, then what you get is an interracial politics, and you have interracial political organizing. You have blacks and whites working together to form coalitions and to make deals and to work together to create a biracial democracy that ultimately elects an abolitionist, Sales Bowen, in 1868 to become mayor of the city. And this is a tremendous triumph, and by 1869, you have a black majority on the city council, including folks like George Hatton, who was a slave 7 years earlier, and now he's sitting on the city council, right? So again, it's a revolutionary time that you're living through, and this interracial coalition, on the one hand, it's inspiring to black political organizers, it's inspiring to white abolitionists, but it's terrifying to a lot of white conservatives in the city. And there are plenty, right? Because the white population, the local white population, by and large, is Southern. It has deep roots in the South. It has sympathies to the South during the Civil War, although they tended not to be secessionists because they were worried that the government would leave and never come back if Maryland, if the South seceded. But they were profoundly sympathetic to the South. They were pro-white supremacy. They were shocked and horrified by first emancipation and then black voting and then blacks being elected to office. Like all of the, and then the laws that were passed by this interracial city council. I mean, you have anti-discrimination laws that are passed in 1869, 1872, 1873. These become eventually the basis for civil rights activism nearly 100 years later. But there's so much happening that is distressful to white conservatives in the city. And they organize. They for a while, they're kind of overrun, and they retreat, they regroup, and they come back with a vengeance. And it really explodes in the early 1870s with disfranchisement. I mean, it ultimately comes first in 1871 with the move to a territorial government, and then in 1874, taking away self-government entirely from the district, becomes permanent in 1878. But this two-step process is a step away. It's a retreat from democracy. It's a retreat from biracial democracy. And it was because of black voting. It was because of interracial politics. It was because of interracial coalitions electing white radicals and black councilmen. This scared folks like Alexander Shepard, who was a councilman who voted against emancipation when he was on the city council during the war. He becomes an editor of the Star newspaper, he becomes the chairman of the Board of Public Works, which was essentially the most powerful position of the territorial government, and eventually becomes governor of the territorial government. But it terrifies folks like that because they worry about losing control of what they considered their city, right? This is our city, and now the federal government has come in and messed it all up by emancipating the slaves, by enfranchising black voters, and now we have these whites and blacks working together. And so it's a complicated process because you do have blacks and whites who are working together in these political coalitions, and then you have a very strong anti-suffrage movement that grows among white conservatives in the city, and ultimately leads to disfranchisement in 1874.
I have to say something. When you see the election of 1872, and it's very clear that with all the Republican activity in which they are pushing for the Republican power in what is the Old Northwest, the depression the nation faces in 1873, and by 1874, the solid Republican move on the part of farmers in the West, where had been Democratic or at least more independent. When the Republican Party's power hardens in that Old Northwest, they can abandon African Americans, and they do it all over the South because it's a power move. Washington is a power city, and it's a microcosm of the nation. And when that power shift goes in the West, the Republicans can abandon African Americans, whether they're in Washington, whether they're in the South, whether these are in these unreconstructed states, and you have to accept that Washington is a power city, and it is a power issue. It is a political issue as much as it is a racial issue. And the whole issue of the shift of power in Washington is very reflective of the shift of power on the national level. So I agree with what you're saying, but I think taking it out of a national context is a bit unfair, that you do have Republicans who are very sympathetic to African Americans when they vote Republican. But when they don't need that Republican vote, when they have those farmers in the West, through all the Morrill Act and all the other acts that ensure through their own money from Civil War for the veterans, et cetera, you can go through and see a litany of activities that the Republicans put in place so that they're not dependent on African Americans, whether it is this African American limited political life. David Terry talks about it for a very brief moment in Washington. But it's understood that this is going to change. And I think it changes in the city just as it changes in the nation. And so I think that it is important to understand there's a confluence when it comes to power and when it comes to politics. And you can't take Washington out of that very significant political arena.
You make a great point, and I would just add that it's, we remember it as radical Reconstruction, but of course the radicals were always a minority within the Republican Party, and so they have this window where they do a lot, but they're always being challenged and that contested by more moderate Republicans who are looking elsewhere for political, to expand the political base. So you're absolutely right.
Thank you. Doug Musgrove, let's look a little bit at some of the broader implications in the African American community, because we see with the development of a 1.2 parades. As you know, Douglas spoke at one of the first. But in 1886, in fact, he gave two speeches. One was to, it was titled On Southern Barbarism. And then he gave another speech. It says, stand strong to suffer and yet to survive. And that just delivered April 16th. Now, in that speech, he did two things. First, he said, we have two celebrations. This should not be. I will not lay blame. And so Douglas is unified. But then later in his speech, he says, and I quote, a tinsel show, gaudy display, and staggering procession which empty the alleys and dark places of our city into broad daylight. Yeah. Tell me about these two Douglases. Is he unifying? Is he separating? Is he looking up to one? Is he looking down upon another? Why does Douglas have this? And what is the relationship to this, to the broader unity amongst the African Americans?
Yes, so the speech you're quoting, I believe, is from 1886, and Douglas delivers it at the end of the parade. So they're always, you have the procession itself, and then you have these large rallies at the end of the parade. And Douglas was speaking in the first year where the parade had actually split. You had a middle-class faction that year led by the editor of the Bee, Calvin Chase. And then you had sort of a more working-class parade led by a sort of Southwest political boss who actually used to be the bodyguard to Boss Shepherd, and his name was, Chris is going to help me here.
Perry Carson.
Perry Carson, thank you. So the parade splits, and Douglas speaks at the end of, I believe, Chase's side of the parade. And the initial part of the speech is that he calls for unity. I mean, he's essentially saying to the larger black community of Washington, D.C., you guys shouldn't be doing two parades. You actually need to get back together. But then he sort of falls back on a certain respectability politics, which puts him, right in league with Chase and with the middle class faction. So that, to step back really quickly, let's remember that, let's see, in '86, so 8 years before, the city loses a vote for good. It had already lost it in 1874, but Congress sort of seals the deal in '78. And what a lot of white DC residents, both conservative Republicans and Democrats, are saying is, we don't ever want the vote back. We supported the fact that it was taken away from us in the first place, and we want to keep it gone. The reason being that if we get it back, these rowdy black working class Republicans are going to run the place, just like they ran it under Sales Bowen. And so we don't want it at all. And by the way, they were grafters. They were stealing things out of the district building. They were misappropriating money. We don't want to go back to that. And what Chase and many middle-class African Americans figure at this point is that if we can separate ourselves from the folks that they're pointing the finger at, the working class folks, the black ward bosses in the working class sections of the city, maybe they'll just take us on our merits, meaning our middle-class respectability. Maybe they'll say, well, Calvin Chase is a very educated man. He publishes a good paper. There's no misspelled words on the front page. And if we take this guy as he is, we have to admit, independent of color, he's just as good as us. And so that's the pitch. Of course, the problem is that's not really what many white DC residents are saying. They're not saying we don't want anyone to vote in DC because of the uncouth African Americans. They don't want anyone to vote in DC because of the African Americans. And so there's this effort on the part of middle class DC to sort of separate themselves from working class DC. The folks, the contraband, and the children of the contraband who had come into the city from the farms of Maryland and Virginia during the war. But it's a losing strategy. It's not actually going to save them. It's not actually going to help them to get into a working political relationship with their white fellow residents. On top of that, if we're honest, is also just a political battle between Chase and Carson. Carson, there is voting in DC during this time, but it's simply for delegates to the National Convention, which means patronage, which is no small thing in a city where the best jobs in the entire place that black folks can get are with the federal government and their patronage jobs, right? By and large. I shouldn't say completely. Civil service reform was initiated in 1883, so there are jobs on merit, but there's still a lot of good patronage jobs. And so there's a struggle to get these delegate seats and the patronage behind them. Chase wants those delegate seats. Carson always beats him out and is able to get people into these elections and control the process. And so the two of them are fighting both for control of the black political community and what spoils exist there. And the place where that plays out is in the Emancipation Day Parade. They split and have two different parades. Chase, to his credit, gets Douglas, which is no small thing. And they have, with varying sort of degrees of separation, separate parades all the way up through the turn of the century. There's a couple times where they come together, but then the next year they'll split apart. And so this is sort of an ongoing battle between the two of them and the factions that they represent. And ultimately, it leads to the end of the large parades. Parades do, in fact, as Dr. Clark Lewis points out, last well into the 20th century before dying off pretty much completely at mid-century. But they're always very tiny. They're sponsored by a single church or a single fraternal order. They're never the mile-long processions with massive floats and people on horseback and elaborate costumes that you would see in the 1860s and 70s and 80s, which is actually the early 80s are a heyday of the parade as well.
Let's think a little bit about the legacy of these parades. We've talked about that quite a bit, and then in about 10 minutes we'll open up to the audience. But today we see the parades, as I think you know, I think it was 1899, that the public school was first, was probably the first year until I think 2000 under the Mayor Williams that the schools were actually closed. But at a certain point, the parade started having a legacy that lasted on into the century and probably lasts now in some forms. Why don't you tell us about that, Dr. Lewis?
I think it's important to remember, as I said, in my education, I'd love to take credit for it, but it was a woman in her late 80s, and I was doing oral histories with her and using mnemonic devices, going through pictures, and she kept going back to these pictures that had people who were doing presentations in the 20s, 30s, and 40s at emancipation events. And I gently explained to her that emancipation events ended in 1899. I was a scholar, I'd read Green and all the other ones, and she very nicely dressed me down and said, I don't care what the book said, emancipation, not emancipation, went on. And she talked about places like Asbury United Methodist Church, and I remember distinctly, unfortunately it was before camera phones when I started in 1991, but she had a series of photographs. She was an avid collector, and she had a wonderful photograph of a young woman, the daughter of Lewis and Ella Johnson. Her name was Elena Johnson, and she's in this gorgeous outfit. And she had won one of the many, they called them oratorical contests, where they had activities in which people participated in the evening, talking about emancipation, continuing it. It's not just in photographs, in many church records. I found records in the Library of Congress for the Nannie Helen Burroughs School. Emancipation continues on a smaller scale. I'd also like to address the issue of the parades. Yes, the parades split, but there was always this issue that scholars seem to skirt, is how the parades were staged. People staged the parades from different areas of the city, and it created the reality of two different parades, but in fact, they were more similar than different. I just think that scholars have a heyday pointing out the differences in African Americans, and they're very, very slow to talk about that long legacy in which there was still unity. People like Dr. Paul Phillips Cook, who, although, as was pointed out, the schools no longer were dismissed after 1899, but he, as the head of the DC Teachers College, he is a graduate of minor in 1933, Dunbar in 1933, minor in 1937, but he, from the time as an English professor in the late 1930s up through the mid-1970s, he insists that all the teacher education final presentations include at least one unit on emancipation. These are the teachers in the DC public schools that are continuing to teach about emancipation. I often felt sad about how much was being lost, but there are so many other young scholars who are taking up the lead on emancipation, and I'm thinking in particular about the fact that you have, and I want to make sure that I get it correct, Dr. Sybil Moses, who's doing wonderful work on the Prince Hall Shriners and the Masons.
She's at the Library of Congress.
Library of Congress. And Dr. Moses is wonderful in using the community-based sources. James Walker and a woman by the name of Jean Sampson Scott had emancipation photographs that they had gotten from the Elks home, the, I should say, Improved Benevolent Protective Order of the Elks of the World. And I'm hoping that her son, Osborne Oscott, has maintained those records. There are so many records about the District of Columbia's maintaining its ability to maintain emancipation, even if it's somehow in the margins of scholarship. It's still in the middle of DC political activity and also local activity. Last and not least, the Nannie Helen Burroughs School records in the Library of Congress. From the 19 teens through the 1950s, when Mrs. Burroughs is having a time with the Baptist congregation and Baptist churches, when she finally gets her school and then moves through the 1950s. There are annual programs that document emancipation. So I caution people when they talk about how many differences and how many problems there were with emancipation. I ask us to constantly remember that these contesting issues never eclipse this whole issue of freedom and how important it was in the not just the mind, but in the everyday activities of individuals all over the city. And I just am so sorry, as I said, that there were no camera phones, because people took me, because I was so sure it ended, people were so happy to show me how it didn't end, and how even if I was a young scholar, that I was incorrect. And I don't care if it was my great aunt, if it was her nemesis. They had this terrible hot hat contest at Asbury, and she took me to her because her niece had won. She wanted me to see these pictures. To people like Dr. Paul Phillips Cook, whose papers at the University District of Columbia really reinforce this idea. So I think emancipation, even if people don't understand it in its larger context, the spirit of emancipation is maintained in the city. And I congratulate the people of the city for that.
Well, thank you. And one thing that Dr. Clark-Lewis did mention is that a different age with lack of communication. In 1872, I recall, there were two parades. And it was quite simple. The people in Georgetown thought the parade has been postponed because of rain. And so the next day they had their parade. But let's get back to one last question, and then we'll open up. Judge Derrick, what do you see as the relationship between the parades past to parades present?
You know, I think commemorations they of course have an attachment to the past. They're about something that occurred in the past. And at the same time, I think they have a great deal to do with the present. You know, just as the telling of history has everything to do with our present needs and wants and understandings of ourselves. You know, I think that Loretta Carter Haynes revived the Emancipation Day celebrations in 1991 in this sort of black nationalist moment where African Americans are looking at this really difficult moment where you have this conservative ascendance in national politics, you have the deterioration of the cities on the local level. DC had just sort of come off of its reign as a murder capital of the United States when she began the celebrations again. And I think she was, you know, and unfortunately I've never been able to interview her about this. I think she was searching for a usable past for young African Americans, and she targeted young African Americans. She was the president of Reading is Fundamental, and she believed very strongly in the emancipatory potential of the past, of the black past.
Paul Phillips Cook. She was one of his students who took that message that he imbued in them. And in 1992, we had a huge activity with events in every one of the wards. But I think it's very reflective, as you said, not only of her idea, but the ideals of individuals who had been her, quote, teachers and the teaching professionals and religious leaders of the city. So you're absolutely correct.
No, and I would add C.R. Gibbs, whose name we have to point out here this evening. C.R. wrote a brilliant article in 1985 in the Washington Post, which was really the first mention that I can find in a newspaper of the Emancipation Day Parade for, you know, somewhere in the area of 40 years after the parade sort of dropped off of the radar in the 50s and 60s. I know that Loretta Carter Haynes was aware of that article, and she then began to build a citywide interest in Emancipation Day over the course of the 90s. Interestingly enough, you know, her efforts really come to wide city attention when she is not able to hold the celebrations. In 1999, she was suffering from DDT poisoning, I believe it was. Someone had fumigated her house, and they had done it with the wrong chemicals, clearly. And so she simply wasn't able, struggling with medical bills, to pay for a wreath that she would take to the Lincoln statue, which the Emancipation Day Parade used to visit after it was constructed in 1876. And so they'd make sure they headed all the way into Capitol Hill, extending the remarkable length of this parade during the 70s and 80s, 1870s and 80s. But she would lay a wreath there every single year in the 1990s, and she wasn't able to in 1999 because of those problems. And all of a sudden, large numbers of DC residents rallied to the cause, students raised the money for a wreath, held a ceremony in June because she had missed the April date. And after that, you started to see a great deal of public support for the parade. By the time we got to 2002, the city council declared it a non-public holiday, a private holiday, founded the parade in 2004. All of this bill is introduced by Vincent Orange. And then we have, essentially the shape of the celebrations that we have today. Interestingly enough, and I think this gets to the core of both Maurice's question and the heart of what Elizabeth, you're talking about when it comes to this usable history that is Emancipation Day. All of the city officials that have participated in Emancipation Day celebrations since the early 2000s have used it as a way to make a pitch for DC statehood, both to the population of the city and to Congress. And you can see this in every public speech that someone does on Emancipation Day. I can remember Jesse Jackson coming back to the city for the sesquicentennial and giving a speech about statehood down on Freedom Plaza a year or two ago. And so, that's, I think, where you end up getting this wonderful connection with the past. The Emancipation Day parades were all about black folks saying to the larger city, to each other, the vision of freedom that has come out of Reconstruction, that all of us, regardless of color, should have equal access to the fruits of American democracy, is still one that people talk about when they celebrate Emancipation Day today. It's just that the terminology they use is, we in DC, 600,000 plus residents, deserve an equal say in our larger democracy, particularly two senators and a member of Congress, so that we can share equally in the fruits of American democracy
today. And in the parades,
today.
there were always signs, and there were reflections of Washington, D.C. African Americans had this unusual burden that whatever was troubling the African Americans in the rest of the nation, it was very much reflected in the parades. They talked about the discrimination laws that were creeping back in. And in the parades, if you get, and unfortunately they don't have film, but people, the reminiscences, they talk about how different issues that were impacting African Americans in the rest of the nation were very much reflected in the parade, whether it was the issue of the turning back of civil rights, post-Reconstruction period, that again, this city and this parade becomes a microcosm of issues, and the African American community here was expected because the parades, as Craig Schifford and others have researched, were a powerful demonstration, not just for this city. They made the point of being on Capitol Hill in these huge numbers to remind Capitol Hill of the importance of African Americans and the concerns of African Americans and this agency that they were bringing, even if they were using emancipation in these parades were speaking to much larger issues.
Yes.
Well, thank you. And it's 8 o'clock exactly, and now we will go to the audience.
Perfect, nicely done.
So please go to the mic. Please now, I come out of the movement, so I am a pretty tough chair, so don't make speeches. Just ask the question, direct your question to a particular person. If you want to make a speech, you can go get your own rally. Answer to the people here, please.
I'm not going to make a speech, so I'll be
Thank
quick about
Take
it.
your time. Just no speeches.
Okay. Dr. Musgrove, I have a couple of questions to ask you. At the time, I didn't realize there were about 34,000 enslaved people that came to the city at the time of the DC Emancipation. But as I understand it, they were housed basically in contraband camps. And during that period, unfortunately, because of the poor infrastructure in the city and just the total number of Union troops, there was a large number of blacks who died as a result of cholera outbreak and smallpox. So I'm just curious about the role that the black middle class here in the district played in trying to bring attention to that terrible epidemic that I think it lasted like from 1862 up to almost 1870. And not only did it was here in this area, but as I understand it, it continued even down to the Deep South. And I think it was illuminated in a book by, I think, Jim Downs, Sick from Freedom. Yeah. And the other quick question I have is that you said something that was interesting. DC was surrounded by particularly for Maryland, it was PG and Montgomery County were basically pro-slave counties. So if a person, you mentioned if a white person proved that they were loyal to the Union, they were able to retrieve their slaves. How were they able to document that they were loyal to the Union? Because basically they were living in counties that were basically bastions of pro-slavery.
So I'll start with the first question because the second one is frustrating in its own way. Those folks who made it into the freedmen's camps that were up at Howard University, that were out at Arlington Cemetery, were really lucky, quite frankly. Large numbers of people not only died from cholera, but from exposure. This 33,000 people or so that come into the city are coming between 1862 and 1865, so they didn't all come at once, I should point out. But they very quickly, as they came in very large waves, keep in mind the town is small, right? I mean, it's clustered in what we now know as downtown, right? Like that's sort of the extent of the city at this time. Even with the explosion of growth that occurred during the Civil War, it's still a very small town as far as its footprint. And a lot of these people didn't get housing. They very quickly overwhelmed first the black communities and then even the federal government's ability to meet their needs, or at least the federal government's desire to meet their needs is probably a better way to put it. And the city government throughout is hostile, right, to these people coming in. So you have a situation in which a large number of people are out of doors, as old folks would say, right? And as a result, what happened to people that are out of doors happened to them. And you can find grave sites around the city that attest to that. Then there's the issue of Maryland. I mean, it's an elaborate fiction, quite frankly, right? Everyone knows in the federal government, in DC, in the Maryland legislature, that Maryland would have seceded if it had not been occupied. Lincoln, fears this and deals with it constantly during the war. And so they sort of work out this idea that, okay, as long as you don't show outward, if you don't say outwardly that you are disloyal, if you don't actually say that I am loyal to the South, I want to secede, we'll just sort of assume that you're loyal, right, and we'll work it out. When you're coming to claim slaves, you actually do have to state that you're loyal. But other than that, that was it. And slavery had not been abolished in Maryland. The property of these people had come into DC. If they came in and claimed their property, it's theirs until 1864 when Maryland abolishes slavery, kind of understanding that the jig is up, right? The institution had been damaged to such a degree by the war there, it's not gonna work out anymore. But it's the law.
And I invite you to look in the DC archives. There are loyalty oaths that people, in fact, utilized to demonstrate this issue of loyalty. So I think that there are other ways of, as you say, documenting loyalty on the local as well as the state and national level. But there are local entities in which you can find these loyalty oaths. Whether people meant it or not, as you said, it's property, and it's a valued property that they're attempting to retrieve.
On one part of your question, you mentioned about they get help. The benevolent tradition in African Americans go a long way. It started with Richard Allen and Absalom Jones in 1791 in Philadelphia during the yellow fever epidemic. And Black Seer kept the same motion up in the churches. In all these groups that march in the demonstrations, a lot of them are fraternity organizations. All of these groups raise money to help the quote-unquote contraband at Camp Barker and Duffy. And then many also go out to Freedman's Village, which becomes a hospital. Then it becomes Freedman's Hospital later on. So there's a long list of churches, Cook and many others, who do pick up and play their role in aiding these quote-unquote contraband.
I just want to add, in terms of Maryland, a lot of folks, you could argue, and I would argue, Maryland's the reason why the Emancipation Proclamation, why DC Emancipation takes so long. There are lots of people in the Republican Party who are pushing and a lot of black folks on the ground pushing Lincoln to make emancipation central to the war, and he's not interested. He's threading a political needle, right? Because he can't lose Maryland. If he loses Maryland, the capital has to move, and so you get this very strange situation in the summer of 1861 into 1862, where Les Layman, Lincoln's self-appointed bodyguard and the head of the D.C. jail, is capturing slaves and throwing them in the D.C. jail and holding them and letting slave owners come and claim them back. And the outcry against this, against using, they called it the blue jug. The Washington City jail was notorious, and abolitionists made this a centerpiece of the push for emancipation after the war begins in 1861-62. They have these big magazine spreads showing pictures of slave families held in the blue jug, slave families who would come to D.C. for freedom, then being imprisoned by the national government, given back to a traitorous slave owner, right? And so this, the slaves coming to the city, running to the city, pushes the envelope. It forces Lincoln's hand to have to deal with this, right? The situation he would prefer not to have to deal with, and kind of accelerates the timeline. So they're, in a lot of ways, they're the catalyst. The slaves running away and coming to D.C. help catalyze the passage of the act.
Again, you have to, take it in a broader perspective. It was the British. When the British threatened to run that paper blockade and continue to trade with the South, that cotton was central. They pulled back because of the abolitionists and the activities. When the British said, if it's not about enslavement, then we're going back to business with the southern states. That international move had a great deal of weight, and it pushed from February and March. It pushed Lincoln as much as anything domestic. Those exposés were splashed all over Europe, early 1861, 1862. Lincoln knew that if the British entered or would then begin that trading again, that enterprise with southern states, the Union was in real trouble. So I think it is looking at both local, regional, national, but you have to also understand the international implications of these exposés about enslavement, and Lincoln's hands were pushed because the threat of the British coming back in to begin to trade again. And the paper blockade, there was no blockade. So the British, the presence of the British, and even the threat of the presence of the British pushed Lincoln. Lincoln, we all know, Lincoln was ambivalent on emancipation. He was ambivalent on a lot of questions that dealt with African Americans. But he knew and understood very well what the presence of the British would mean to that Confederate economy.
Yes, sir.
You kind of pick up on what I was going to ask, but because I'm from the Caribbean, I must say. And what I find a little bit missing at this point in time is the international context of this debate. And especially, for example, the role that Haiti plays in all of this situation. Certainly the struggle in Haiti for independence, and then 1804 independence of Haiti. And then, obviously, England doing away with slavery in 1833 or 32, 33, and in France, right? I'm so-called French-Dutch, in 1845. And the consequences that had for here, but also other consequences, right? The fact that in 1861-62, the United States steps forward to, for the first time, to acknowledge the independence of black states, right? Haiti and Liberia, right? So how all of this plays into that. That's the first part of it.
Now, but we want your question now.
No, that's the first part. That's the question, right?
Right, so
how does this all play into that
right.
process, right?
Okay.
The second question is, obviously, DC is in the process now of a massive gentrification, and also a massive, there's just no other way to put it, a whitening of the population, right? I think African Americans now, for the first time, have become minority in DC, right?
Not minority, they're just not 50%.
Not 50%, but you know, but
Not a minority, it's not 50%.
But it's certainly not the majority they
That's
were
right,
before,
that's
right? How do you see? I mean, you know, there's an undertone of this in what you guys have spoken about. If this movement continues, right, and DC becomes 60 or 70% basically white, or
significantly white. Do you believe that DC is going to continue to be without statehood, or do you then see at that point in time a major move towards statehood?
I'd like to touch on the first part. Selwyn Carrington was one of the many scholars from the Caribbean. Selwyn is originally from Trinidad, and one of his books touches on this issue of how the Caribbean impacted on enslavement and Caribbean policy. There are a number of other scholars from the Caribbean also who early on, 1920s, 30s, and 40s, are writing about this presence and the whole issue of the Caribbean and these issues of enslavement and the interruption of trade and this long-term impact. So I think there are a number of studies that affirm what you're saying, but in a very anecdotal way, in traveling to the Caribbean, I was startled on 3 different islands, and the first one I encountered was in Nassau. They had an Emancipation Square, and they talked very prominently about DC emancipation. And this was in 1981. I was startled. I had no idea that DC emancipation resonated the way it did with Caribbean islands, the Caribbean islands. So I think that there are any number of examples that you're bringing up, that there are these worldwide connections when you look at emancipation and understand it. But what has always startled me is this presence and the importance and the significance of the District of Columbia in many of these writings, in whether it was Francophone, whether it was Dutch, whether it was in other islands, that these issues were very germane to not only what was written, but as I said, there were markers in this Caribbean island that we didn't even have at that point so obvious a marker in the city at that time. So I think your point is well taken, and it does internationalize this whole issue in a way. Carol Bean, who wrote for the book First Freed, she wrote about in the English, the Dutch, and the Spanish islands, this whole issue of emancipation, and touched on some points, not just of national emancipation, but local and regional issues. So thank you for your question.
I would add to that, just looking at it from the other side, from the white conservative side. Haiti and Jamaica, the Caribbean nations were the boogeyman of the conservative white imagination, right? Like, this is what they wanted to avoid. This was what they were worried would happen to DC if there was emancipation. It's like, oh my gosh, if there's going to be emancipation, the blacks will just take over, right? If you give black folks the right to vote, they're going to take over, right? And they would point to Haiti in particular and other Caribbean nations. Often they would bring it into editorials and letters to the editor to use it as an argument against any granting any kind of rights or emancipation to African Americans.
And the second part of his question, anyone want to? The message today, gentrification, anybody?
I don't think, no one in Congress is going to move any legislation on any issue, much less on DC statehood. So no, I don't think the change in demographics of the city are going to move the city much closer towards statehood. If you look at the struggles for statehood in the early 20th century, when some white DC residents were advocating for statehood, it didn't get much traction then. Granted, one of the big objections was that black people would get the vote, and it's about a 30% black city, but I just don't think it's going to help that much. Our partisan politics can operate outside of race to a certain degree when conservatives in Congress are essentially saying, I don't want black people to vote in DC. I also don't want white liberals to vote in DC either. Mm-hmm. And so I just don't think that. Now, granted, it's impossible to decouple the two, but I don't think that anybody's going to move that legislation anytime soon.
Okay, I couldn't tell which one of you gentlemen, so I'll just go and you be honest with me. So who's next?
Okay, my question for any panelist, besides the 3,000 people that were freed at emancipation, how about enslaved people who were living and working in the district, but they'd been hired from owners in Maryland or Virginia? Was that a significant number of people, and what was the attention to that population?
Well, that's a great question. I want to bring up this wonderful piece that was in Washington History earlier by Dr. Clark Lewis's colleague at Howard, Joe Reedy, who took a story about this slave owner who lived in what's northeast Washington, right along the Maryland border. His plantation straddled the line, and he had slaves working on the entire plantation. Well, as word gets out that this emancipation bill is about to pass, he gets nervous, and so what he does is he builds this ramshackle slave quarters on the Maryland side of the line of his plantation on the Maryland side, moves his slaves over there and instructs them that they can only tend the cattle on the Maryland side. They have to stop at the border. There's a creek or something that's the border between the district and Maryland, and then makes the argument that they are in fact Maryland residents and therefore not subject to the Emancipation Act. And what happens is that the slaves themselves, this family of 5, says, well, no, actually, we are district residents. We are entitled to our freedom. And they petition the commissioners directly because the initial Emancipation Act required owners to come and ask for compensation in order for the bureaucratic wheels to start moving. Well, if an owner like this Mr. McCormick in 1862, if he says, well, I don't have any district slaves, I'm not entitled to any compensation because my slaves are still enslaved. There was nothing the slaves could do. So they had to pass an amendment to close that loophole that allowed slaves to petition for themselves, and which this family did, and they were able to petition directly to the commissioners and say, we are indeed enslaved. And they did. They won. By December of that year, they had to spend a whole extra agricultural season enslaved illegally. But they ended up winning. So you do have this situation where district owners slave owners who have property in Maryland, they will send their slaves out to Maryland. You had congressmen who had brought slaves with them, who send them home, to Kentucky and to their home states, so that they are not subject to the DC Emancipation Law. So you do have evidence of that. There are people who are kind of stuck in this limbo.
I would invite you to look at the records of Oxen. It's now Oxen Hill Park, but it was called Oxen Farm, and that's another example of a farm on the line. But the records indicated that no matter what the individuals who own these enslaved people did, as quickly as this issue becomes known to the people were running. And that was the big problem, that you could do anything you wanted, but as the word spread, and the records at Oxen Run Park are wonderful, and they're also in the purview of the National Park Service, they show how people were leaving. They were moving toward freedom with their feet, and that was always an issue. I'd also invite people to look at the records of a church like Asbury, which was always at 11th and K Street, and how many people came and literally lived there, and then through the membership were then, for lack of a better term, farmed out. They then lived with other African Americans in the city. So there was this reciprocal support network that people had worked out on their own, absent of the activities of the local, regional, or state government or national government. So I think it is a dynamic, as you said, that is just so full of these stories, but frequently much of the richness of this whole social fabric that we are trying to weave together, you have to go to these local records at the local archives, DC archives, and archives in the state of Maryland, et cetera, where you get a real sense of how these lives were changed, owners and enslaved people, by this whole emancipation and the presence and the promise of freedom, as you point out.
And just one point, if you look at the numbers, $900,000 is about 3,000 slaves. There are about 100 slave masters who refuse the money, and because they don't believe Lincoln has the right to emancipate, and they just aren't compensated. So, and the slaves are eventually freed. Yes, sir.
I'm a native Washingtonian and a longtime member of the Association of Otis Inhabitants, established in December of 1865. We'll be celebrating our 150th anniversary later this year. I've always been raised to believe that Boss Shepherd was a great hero of self-government and home rule and racial equality. And then I read Kate Mazur's book, which comes up with a very, very different view of not only Ball Shepherd, but for that matter, my own group, AOI. So one of AOI's great successes in recent years was getting the statue of Ball Shepherd rescued from the Blue Plains sewage treatment, where its statue had been languishing for years, and reestablished in front of the Wilson Building. Should we now turn around and send that statue back to Blue Plains?
Don't put it in front of the Wilson Building. Put it somewhere, but don't put it there.
I think local politics, whether they're local politics in Boston, whether they're local politics in New York, whether they're local politics in Chicago, local politics are local politics, and graft and corruption are not unique to the District of Columbia. You talked about the whole issue of jobs and people wanting to use whatever mechanisms possible to get and deliver jobs. I think that, like many figures in history, Boss Shepherd, it is a checkered history. But I think that there is no question that the building that he did enhanced the city and modernized the city on many levels. That cost money, it meant jobs, and it didn't always go in the most fair way. But I think that it is an issue. Professor Mazur's work uses national records. We were on a panel together, and she was startled to learn that there were so many church and local records. If you use national records, you get a national perspective. If you are not using extensive local records, or you haven't looked at local records, then you get a different view. It is not incorrect. It is a view that's based on one set of records. There are various kinds of interpretations that may or may not evolve, but I think that, I'm not defending her, but it is very clear that she focused on legislative records, the Capitol Hill records. There's very, very little in local records. She was amazed, that, as I said, that there were church records. She was amazed that there were personal records. I'm startled, but it is the way that she wrote her book.
Well, I'll defend Professor Mazur because I think her analysis of Boss Shepherd is spot on in a lot of ways. I mean, he did, as Dr. Clark Lewis indicated, I mean, he spent a lot of money. You know, he did a lot of infrastructure development. You know, a lot of folks called him the father of modern Washington, you know, because there was so much that was done on his watch when he was the head of the Board of Public Works. And, you know, he had sort of a by any means necessary kind of attitude to civic improvement, to economic improvement. But that came at a cost, you know, because, and again, it's tied into the larger narrative of graft and corruption that people were using against President Grant and the Republican Party in general. But what happens in DC is it gets racialized. And people attribute the corruption and the graft and the mismanagement and the overspending, all the negative parts of Boss Shepherd's reign, they attribute to colored voters, you know, is what they would say. You know, that it was the black voters who put him in charge. Mind you, there were only 2 of 22 of the legislature, members of the legislature were black at the time. And these are Republican editorialists often singing the same tune, saying, well, you know, because of corruption, you know, black people voting has led to this corruption. We need to disfranchise all the voters of DC in order to institute a much more honest and efficient government. And Boss Shepherd was the reason, you know, the creator of a lot of this corruption and graft. And so what happens is he's kind of run out of office. He goes off to Mexico and lives the rest of his life there. But his reputation is rehabilitated 10 or 20 years later by AOI and other folks in Washington who see him as the father of modern Washington. They build the statue in 1909. And so all the greatness that they saw of Washington, they attribute to him, and all the corruption and the graft they attribute to black voting.
Is that different than South Carolina? I mean, that's Reconstruction politics.
Yes,
Right.
it is.
Exactly.
I'm sorry, it's politics, and it's no different. Please watch Birth of a Nation. I mean, you get the attribution of everything that was negative about post-Civil War life. It's attributed to African Americans. That's That's a historical reality.
Right.
Okay, well, so we have two more. You know, I don't know if anybody ever goes to the Kennedy Center, but if you go a minute late, they cut the lights out because it's heavy union labor. So I don't know what the archivist, but he pays the same union labor, so he might throw us out. So let's get your questions very quickly.
All right, this is really, really quick. Thank you, panel. Good evening. I want to just ask, I actually work in the DCPS school system. So I've had conversations with children and fellow colleagues, and I want to say it's an absence of knowledge of what DC Emancipation Day is. I'm not a native Washingtonian, but when I moved here, you know, I didn't have work one day, and I asked, why don't I have work tomorrow? You know, DC Emancipation Day, what's that? I took the further step of trying to look into it and trying to gain some knowledge about it. But saying that, I went to the parade earlier. I saw the presence of some elementary schools, some schools in the area. Do you think that between the time that the parade wasn't present, that in that period, that the lack of push and emphasis on DC Emancipation has weakened in like DCPS? Because a lot of these kids aren't getting educated to understand what DC Emancipation Day is. They just think, oh, I had the day off tomorrow, cool, DC Emancipation Day, but they're not really understanding and grasping the significance of it all.
I think you see teachers who, from the late 1950s onward, who are discouraged when it comes to teaching DC Emancipation because there's this push for integration. And with the push for integration, there is this whole issue of limiting the former way history was taught. People like Paul Phillips Cook and one of his students, Mrs. Loretta Carter Haynes. You can argue that. I just think that there's a learning curve. And I think we have people like Vincent Orange, we've had a series of mayors. It is not going to happen overnight. I would invite you to question people in Denver or areas of Texas to talk about Juneteenth. They know what they do as a celebration, but its long-term historical impact is lost on many of them. I think there's an educational process. There were several DC history civics books that didn't even mention DC Emancipation. So I think that it's going to come over time, but it's unfair to expect it to come immediately. But I think that just as the current administration, others have worked very hard to inform people of emancipation, there is a time element and there is an educational lag.
And this has been an issue, I should just to add to that, that organizers of the events have been struggling with since the early 1990s. I mean, Loretta Carter Haynes would head out to the Lincoln statue to lay the wreath, and she'd get 40 or 50 people some years. The parade, when it was first held, it was downtown, had a couple hundred people. The Washington Post was very kind, and it said, look, it was because it was hot. It was 90 degrees on the day of the first modern parade. But it hasn't drawn really large crowds since. And why exactly that is, I think that when it comes down to it, modern DC residents haven't found the connection. It's not to say that there isn't one. They just haven't found it. And that is the challenge for the organizers and the challenge for the city government to connect to not just all the school kids, predominantly African American, who are coming out to the parade when you're talking about public schools, but to a larger population, which is changing quite rapidly, right? The large numbers of well-to-do millennials, majority white, coming into the city. Can organizers make a pitch that Emancipation Day has a real relevance for them? And it does, right? Emancipation made this country a democratic country to a much greater degree than it had been previous to that time. It was white supremacist, exclusionary republic prior to that. And so the question is, can organizers communicate that? And it's a difficult trick. I don't think anyone's quite figured it out yet, but they're certainly trying.
Crowds for the Cherry Blossom Festival, but I would ask you, I don't think that there's any secret that that's a significant portion of that crowd. They're not DC residents. So how do you begin to make this a national celebration that begins to pull in people from all over the country? I think the elected officials are trying, but it's going to be a process. I think it's going to be a process.
Well, thank you. And after the program, why don't you come down and speak to them and get somebody? Yes, sir.
I don't know if one of you could speak just briefly about the actual genesis of the Emancipation Bill in the Congress, like what was the sort of the political genesis of it, and did Lincoln say or write anything about it at the time when it was going through?
Well, I'll jump on this. So Lincoln actually, when he was a congressman, a one-term congressman from Illinois in 1849, 1850, he actually wrote up a bill to emancipate slaves in the district. But he had some caveats. He was influenced in part by his boarding house mates, including Joshua Giddings, who was a prominent, very bellicose abolitionist, probably the most aggressive abolitionist in Congress at the time. And so he wrote up a bill to have gradual emancipation of slaves in the district, but with a caveat, and that was the people of the district had to have a say. As long as they were supportive, he would push the bill. He also wanted colonization, that there would be a provision to colonize the freed slaves in Africa or somewhere else, but outside of the United States. He wanted compensation for the slave owners, and he actually talked to local leaders. He was led to believe, he thought that he was going to get support from DC leaders, but found out he was mistaken. And the DC white leadership was adamantly opposed to any talk of any kind of emancipation. He dropped talk of that. Fast forward 10 years, once the war has started and the South secedes, what happens is the Democrats all leave, and so that opens up the legislative agenda for the Republicans. And so you have a Massachusetts Senator, Henry Wilson, who was a prominent abolitionist before the war, had been waiting, in a sense, for an opportunity to push this measure, which he does in the spring of 1862. And again, it's not what Frederick Douglass would have. It's not the bill that Frederick Douglass would have written, and Lincoln signs it because it has compensation. It also has a colonization. It provides $1 million to compensate slave owners, and then it provides $100,000 to help freed slaves go to Liberia. And this was a huge part of Lincoln's thinking. Was in his mind and to the mind of many moderate Republicans, they could not foresee, they could not envision a political equality for emancipated black people in this country. And so the only humane solution in their mind was to send them away. And Lincoln continues to be a colonization for up through almost to the end of his life. And DC black leaders go and meet with him, have a very confrontational meeting with him after the Emancipation Bill is passed, in which they say, we don't want colonization. You need to basically call off the dogs, because they were trying to recruit contrabands to go to Africa. And so black leaders like John F. Cook, the young John F. Cook, they worked to counter the colonization movement in the city. But it's Henry Wilson who writes the bill and pushes it through. And he also writes the bill for public schools. That later gets passed, the bill that ends the black codes. And so it's a small group of radical Republicans who are able to take advantage of the lack of Southern Democrat opposition.
And to her credit, Kate Masur does a great job of showing those political interfaces that then lead to these kinds of changes. And I think that, as he's saying, it's very clear that it's not simply a local issue, that it very much resonates with the power politics at the national level, and how critical that is to understanding this whole movement.
Well, thank you all for coming. Thank the archivists and the archives. Thank the secretary. And I urge you all to just go pick up a book on Washington, attend many events, because the Lincoln events are all over town. So, and the others. Thank you very much. Good night.